I still remember the exact moment my phone lit up with his name, David Chen. 3 months after our brutal breakup, 3 months of blessed silence, and there he was, not calling to apologize, not texting to check in, but sitting across from my managing director's desk with $1 million contract and a smile that I knew all too well. The same smile he wore when he thought he was being clever. The same smile that should have been my first red flag. My colleague Jessica poked her head into my office that Tuesday morning in October, her expression somewhere between excitement and confusion. "Sarah," she said, "we just landed TechFlow Solutions as a client. Huge account, complete rebrand, and digital strategy overhaul. Robert wants you to lead it personally." I felt my coffee go cold in my hands. TechFlow Solutions. David's company. The one he'd built from nothing while we were together. The one he'd poured every waking moment into. The one that had become more important to him than our relationship, our future, or basic human decency. I walked down the hallway to Robert's office in what felt like slow motion, my heels clicking against the polished concrete floors of our Austin high-rise. Sterling & Associates had been my home for 6 years. I'd built their entire digital marketing division from the ground up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Turned us from a traditional PR firm into one of the most sought-after marketing consultancies in Texas. I'd worked late nights, missed family dinners, canceled weekend plans, all to prove myself in an industry that loved to remind women that we had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But I'd made it. At 28, I was the youngest senior consultant in the firm's history. I had my own office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake, a team of talented strategists who actually respected my leadership, and clients who trusted me with multi-million-dollar campaigns. I'd earned every square inch of that success, and David knew it, which is exactly why seeing his name on a client contract felt like watching a predator circle its prey. Robert Kim was practically glowing when I knocked on his door. "Sarah, come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his massive oak desk. "This is incredible news. TechFlow Solutions wants to do a complete company rebrand. They're going public next year and need someone who understands both the tech sector and sophisticated brand positioning. The retainer alone is more than most firms see in 6 months." I forced a smile and nodded, but my mind was racing. David didn't believe in rebranding. During our relationship, I'd suggested updating TechFlow's outdated logo and website dozens of times. He'd always brushed me off, saying substance mattered more than style, that he didn't need pretty marketing to make his company successful. So why now? Why the sudden interest in branding? And why Sterling & Associates specifically? Austin had dozens of marketing firms, many of them bigger and more established than us. The answer hit me like a physical blow. He knew I worked here. He knew this would put me in an impossible position. If I told Robert about our history, I'd look unprofessional, like I couldn't separate personal from business. If I didn't, I'd be walking into whatever trap David had set. But I'd learned something important during our relationship and its aftermath. David always underestimated me. He saw emotions where I had strategy, saw weakness where I had preparation. He thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but he'd never bothered to learn that I'd been thinking several moves ahead all along. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. 2 days to prepare, 2 days to figure out how to handle seeing the man who'd systematically tried to destroy my confidence for the better part of a year. David had a way of making you question your own reality. When I'd started getting promoted at Sterling & Associates, he'd suggest I was only advancing because Robert had a thing for me. When clients praised my work, he'd point out small mistakes I'd made, reminding me that success could disappear as quickly as it came. When I'd finally gotten the courage to end our engagement, he'd told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that no one would ever love me the way he did. that I'd never find another man willing to put up with my career obsession. 3. Months of therapy had helped me see those comments for what they were: systematic attempts to make me smaller, to make me doubt my worth so I'd be easier to control. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. And the thought of sitting across a conference table from David made my chest tight with anxiety I hadn't felt in months. I spent Wednesday evening in my downtown apartment reviewing everything I knew about TechFlow Solutions. Their revenue had tripled in the past 2 years, largely due to a software platform they'd developed for small businesses. They'd started getting attention from venture capital firms and tech publications. From the outside, it looked like David had finally achieved everything he'd worked for. But I knew him better than the business press did. Success had never been enough for David. He needed to win, needed to prove he was smarter than everyone else, needed to make sure anyone who'd ever doubted him paid the price. I'd doubted him. I'd left him right when his company was taking off, right when he thought he deserved a supportive fiancé who would make his success look even more impressive. Instead, I'd chosen my own career, my own dreams, my own life. And David Chen didn't forgive that kind of betrayal. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather for Austin. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue blazer and matching skirt, professional but not trying too hard. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones that always made me feel grounded and strong. I arrived at the office early, reviewed my notes one more time, and tried to quiet the voice in my head that kept whispering warnings. Our main conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Colorado River, a polished mahogany table that could seat 12, and abstract art that cost more than most people's cars. It was designed to impress clients, to make them feel like they were working with serious professionals who understood the value of presentation. I was arranging my materials when I heard familiar laughter in the hallway. David's laugh, the one that used to make me smile, now made my shoulders tense involuntarily. He walked in wearing a charcoal gray suit I didn't recognize, his black hair styled differently than I remembered, accompanied by 2 people I assumed were his marketing director and CFO. For a split second, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then his expression shifted into professional neutrality, as if we were complete strangers about to discuss quarterly projections. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, extending his hand with a smile. That didn't reach his eyes. "I've heard excellent things about your work." I shook his hand briefly, matching his tone perfectly. "Mr. Chen, welcome to Sterling & Associates. I'm looking forward to learning more about TechFlow's vision for the future." The next hour was surreal. David outlined his company's growth, their plans for going public, their need for sophisticated brand positioning that would appeal to both consumers and investors. He spoke eloquently about market positioning and competitive differentiation, using marketing terminology he'd never bothered to learn during our relationship. His colleagues nodded along, occasionally adding details about budget constraints or timeline expectations. And through it all, David never once acknowledged that we'd ever met before, never gave any indication that he'd once told me I was the most important person in his life. I took detailed notes, asked intelligent questions, and began sketching out initial strategic recommendations. This was what I did best, taking complex business challenges and finding creative solutions that delivered real results. But I couldn't shake the feeling that David was studying me, waiting for something. Every time I looked up from my notepad, his attention seemed focused not on my words but on my reactions, as if he was running some kind of experiment and I was the test subject. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to follow up with a detailed proposal by the following week. As David and his team gathered their materials to leave, he lingered just long enough to speak quietly near my chair. "You look well, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Success suits you." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the conference room with the faint scent of his cologne and a growing certainty that whatever game he was playing, it was just getting started. That afternoon, I threw myself into research with an intensity that surprised even me. I read every article about TechFlow Solutions, analyzed their current marketing materials, studied their competitors, and began developing what would genuinely be an exceptional rebranding strategy. If David thought he could make me do subpar work by rattling me emotionally, he was about to learn how wrong he was. My success hadn't been built on luck or connections or any of the dismissive explanations he'd offered during our relationship. It had been built on relentless preparation, creative thinking, and an absolute refusal to let anyone make me smaller than I was. But even as I worked, part of my mind kept circling back to a conversation we'd had 6 months before our breakup. I'd been celebrating a major client win, a campaign that had exceeded all expectations and earned recognition from industry publications. Instead of congratulating me, David had suggested that my boss was probably taking credit for my work, that successful women in marketing were usually just fronts for the men who did the real strategic thinking. When I'd gotten angry, he'd backpedaled, claiming he was just trying to protect me from disappointment, that he wanted me to be realistic about how the business world worked. That night, I'd started paying closer attention to how David spoke about my career, my achievements, my potential. I'd started noticing how often his support came wrapped in warnings, how his advice always seemed designed to make me more cautious, more dependent on his opinion, less confident in my own judgment. I'd started documenting things, not because I planned to leave him, but because I needed to make sense of the growing disconnect between who I thought I was and who he kept telling me I was. Those notes, tucked away in a folder on my laptop, had eventually given me the clarity I needed to end our engagement. But they'd also given me something else, something David didn't know about. They'd given me a pattern of behavior that any reasonable person would recognize as deliberate undermining. As I sat in my office that evening, watching the sunset over Lady Bird Lake, I realized that David's decision to hire Sterling and Associates wasn't random revenge. It was strategic. He was positioning himself to have control over my biggest professional opportunity, and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Years. He could make unreasonable demands, claim my work wasn't meeting expectations, suggest to Robert that maybe I wasn't the right fit for such an important client. He could systematically undermine my reputation the same way he'd undermined my confidence, except this time he'd be paying for the privilege. But David had made one crucial miscalculation. He was still thinking of me as the woman who'd doubted herself, who'd second-guessed her instincts, who'd needed his approval to feel valuable. He didn't know about the 6 months of therapy, the confidence I'd rebuilt, the professional victories I'd achieved without him. He didn't know about the contract amendment I'd negotiated with Sterling and Associates after a different client had tried to poach me for their in-house team. He didn't know that I'd learned to protect myself not just emotionally, but legally. 3 years ago, when Margaret Torres had been promoted to senior partner, she'd pulled me aside for a conversation that had changed everything. "Sarah," she'd said, "you're talented enough that people are going to try to steal you, sabotage you, or take credit for your work. The only way to survive in this industry is to make sure you're protected on paper, not just in principle." She'd helped me negotiate an amendment to my employment contract that included intellectual property protections, client interference clauses, and specific remedies if anyone tried to damage my professional reputation through false or malicious complaints. At the time, I'd thought the contract language was probably unnecessary. I'd been naive enough to believe that good work spoke for itself, that professionalism was always rewarded, that people in business operated with basic integrity. David had taught me how wrong I was about that last part, but he'd also taught me something else, something he definitely hadn't intended. He'd taught me that the best defense against manipulation was meticulous preparation, and I'd been preparing for this moment, in one form or another, for 3 years. Friday morning brought a text message that confirmed my suspicions. David's number, which I hadn't deleted from my phone despite every instinct telling me to block it completely. Looking forward to working together again, it read. I think this partnership is going to be very educational for both of us. The message was innocuous enough that anyone reading it would see simple professional courtesy. But I knew David's communication style, knew how he layered meaning into seemingly innocent statements. He was letting me know that he remembered our history, that this wasn't business as usual, that he had plans I couldn't see yet. I screenshot the message and saved it to a folder I'd created on my secure cloud drive. Then I did something David probably wasn't expecting. I forwarded the message to my personal email with a timestamp and context note, creating a digital paper trail that established the beginning of what I suspected was going to be a pattern of inappropriate communication. If David wanted to play games, I was going to document every move. I'd learned during our relationship that his memory became remarkably selective when it served his interests. This time, I was going to make sure there was no ambiguity about what had actually been said or done. The weekend passed quietly, but Monday brought the first sign that my instincts had been correct. Robert called me into his office with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between confusion and concern. "Sarah," he said, closing the door behind me, "I got an interesting call this morning from David Chen. Apparently, there were some concerns about the initial meeting, some questions about whether you're the right fit for this project." My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of concerns?" I asked. Robert looked uncomfortable, the way men always did when they had to navigate situations involving personal relationships they didn't understand. "He seemed to think there might be some kind of history between you two," Robert continued. "He didn't say anything specific, just suggested that maybe the team dynamics weren't quite right, that perhaps Jessica or one of our other senior consultants might be better suited for this particular client." The beautiful thing about having spent 6 years building a reputation was that Robert knew my work, knew my professionalism, knew that client concerns about my performance were so unusual they bordered on suspicious. But David was counting on the fact that most people, when faced with conflict, chose the path of least resistance. Why risk $1 million contract over one employee, even a valued one? I took a careful breath and made a decision that would change everything. "Robert," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you respond. David Chen and I have a personal history. We were engaged until 3 months ago. I didn't mention it initially because I believed I could handle the professional relationship appropriately, and I still believe that. But if he's already raising concerns about my suitability for this project, then you need to know the full context." Robert's eyebrows shot up, but he nodded for me to continue. "David has a pattern of behavior when it comes to undermining people he perceives as threats," I said. "During our relationship, he consistently tried to make me doubt my professional abilities and judgment. I have documentation of this behavior, including text messages and emails. If he's hired Sterling and Associates specifically to create problems for me, then we need to be prepared for what that means, both for me personally and for the firm's reputation." Robert was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd told him. Then he asked the question I'd been hoping he would ask. "What kind of documentation, and how detailed?" I opened my laptop and showed him the folder I'd been building for over a year. Screenshots of text messages where David had questioned my competence, email threads where he'd suggested my professional successes were due to factors other than skill, documented instances of him contradicting my expertise in front of others, and most importantly, a detailed timeline showing how his undermining behavior had escalated whenever my career achievements had threatened his sense of control. Robert read through everything carefully, his expression growing more serious with each example. "This is a problem," he said finally. "If a client is using our services as a vehicle for personal harassment of our employees, that's not just unprofessional, it's potentially illegal. And if we allow it to continue, we're not just failing you, We're opening the firm up to liability. He looked at me directly. Do you want to continue working on this project, or would you prefer to step back and let someone else handle it? I'd been waiting for this moment, the moment when I could choose how to respond to David's latest attempt to control my life. 3 months ago, I might have stepped back, might have chosen the safe path that avoided conflict and potential drama. But therapy had taught me something important about patterns of behavior. They only stopped when someone refused to participate in them anymore. I want to continue with the project, I told Robert. I want to do exceptional work that speaks for itself. But I also want protection. And I want documentation of everything that happens from this point forward. Robert nodded slowly. Then we're going to handle this very carefully, he said. All communication with TechFlow goes through me from now on. Every meeting includes at least one witness. Every deliverable is reviewed and approved by Margaret Torres before it goes to the client. And if David Chen makes any more inappropriate comments or suggestions about your performance, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation with him. For the first time since I'd seen David's name on that contract, I felt something other than anxiety. I felt prepared. The following Tuesday morning brought the first test of our new protocols. David had requested a progress meeting, claiming he needed to review initial concepts before his board presentation later that week. Robert scheduled it for 10 a.m. in our largest conference room, with Jessica and Margaret both attending as witnesses. I spent Monday evening perfecting a presentation that would have impressed any legitimate client. Comprehensive market analysis, innovative branding concepts, detailed implementation timelines, and budget projections that demonstrated both creativity and fiscal responsibility. When David arrived, he brought 3 people I hadn't seen before. His assistant, a nervous-looking woman who took detailed notes, his head of operations, a stern man in his 50s who seemed more interested in his phone than our presentation, and surprisingly, a lawyer. The presence of legal counsel at a routine creative meeting was unusual enough that Margaret raised an eyebrow, but David explained it away smoothly. He was being cautious about intellectual property concerns, he said, given the sensitive nature of their upcoming public offering. I began my presentation with confidence, walking through market positioning strategies that would differentiate TechFlow from their competitors while appealing to both their existing customer base and potential investors. The concepts were solid, innovative without being risky, and backed by research that demonstrated clear understanding of their industry. David listened intently, but not in the way clients usually did. Instead of focusing on the strategic recommendations, he seemed to be studying my delivery, looking for flaws in my presentation style, rather than evaluating the substance of my ideas. 20 minutes into my presentation, David raised his hand to interrupt. I'm sorry, Sarah, but I'm having trouble following your logic here. This slide shows market research from 6 months ago, but you're presenting it as current data. That's either sloppy research or deliberately misleading our team. The room went quiet. I felt my face flush, but not with embarrassment, with anger. The data was current, pulled from industry reports published just 3 weeks earlier. But David was creating a narrative of incompetence in front of witnesses, exactly the way he used to do during our relationship when he wanted to make me doubt my own expertise. Actually, David, I said calmly, this research was published on September 15th of this year. Here's the original source documentation. I pulled up the report on my laptop, showing the publication date clearly visible on the screen. Perhaps there was some confusion about the timeline. David's jaw tightened almost, imperceptibly, but he recovered quickly. Of course, he said with a practiced smile. I must have been thinking of a different report. Please continue. But the interruption had served its purpose. It had planted a seed of doubt about my competence in front of people who didn't know me, well enough to recognize the manipulation. Over the next 30 minutes, David interrupted me 4 more times, each time questioning details that were easily verifiable, each time forcing me to defend work that was clearly excellent. His team, looked increasingly uncomfortable, but they didn't challenge him. They were his employees, dependent on his approval and their paychecks. They weren't going to contradict their boss to defend a consultant they'd just met. After the meeting ended, Margaret lingered while the others gathered their materials. "That was interesting," she said quietly. "In 20 years of client presentations, I've never seen someone nitpick documentation that thoroughly without offering any substantive feedback on the actual strategy. It felt almost like he was looking for problems rather than solutions." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. The adrenaline from defending my work against baseless attacks was still coursing through my system, making my hands shake slightly as I packed up my laptop. Robert approached as David's team headed toward the elevators. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to write up a detailed summary of today's meeting, including specific quotes from the client's feedback. Send it to both Margaret and me before the end of the day. We need documentation of exactly what was said and how it was said." I understood what he was really asking for. He wanted a record of David's behavior that would protect both me and the firm if this pattern continued. That afternoon, I transcribed my notes while the conversation was still fresh in my memory. David's interruptions, his accusations of sloppy research, his dismissive comments about my presentation style, and most importantly, his team's obvious discomfort with his behavior. I included timestamps, direct quotes, and context for each interaction. When I finished, the document was 4 pages long and painted a clear picture of a client more interested in creating conflict than receiving quality service. Jessica stopped by my office as I was preparing to leave for the day. "I've been thinking about that meeting all afternoon," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I've sat through hundreds of client presentations, and I've never seen anything like that. Normal clients ask questions about strategy, budget, timeline, implementation. They don't spend 40 minutes questioning the publication dates of your source materials." It felt personal, like he had some kind of agenda that had nothing to do with branding his company. I appreciated her validation more than she probably realized. David was skilled at making his manipulative behavior seem reasonable in the moment, but it rarely held up to scrutiny from objective observers. The fact that both Jessica and Margaret had noticed something off about his approach confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about improving his company's brand positioning. This was about positioning me for failure. Wednesday brought an email that made David's strategy even more transparent. He wanted to schedule additional meetings, he said, because he wasn't confident that the current approach aligned with TechFlow's vision. He suggested that perhaps we needed to start over with a different creative direction, maybe bring in some outside perspective to ensure we were on the right track. The subtext was clear. He was laying groundwork to claim that my work was inadequate, that the project required more resources than anticipated, that maybe I wasn't the right person to lead such an important initiative. Robert's response was swift and professional. He thanked David for his feedback and suggested that before making any major changes to the project scope, we should schedule a comprehensive review meeting with all stakeholders present. He copied Margaret, Jessica, and me on the email, ensuring that everyone was aware of the client's concerns and our proposed response. He also included a subtle reminder that any significant changes to the project scope would require a new contract and additional budget approval. The review meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, giving me 3 days to prepare not just creative materials, but a comprehensive defense of my work. I spent those days building an airtight case that demonstrated the quality, research, and strategic thinking behind every recommendation I'd made. I gathered testimonials from previous clients, industry recognition for similar campaigns, and detailed explanations of my methodology that would be difficult for anyone to question without revealing their own lack of expertise. Thursday evening, Margaret invited me to dinner at her favorite restaurant downtown. She'd been my mentor since I'd started at Sterling & Associates, guiding me through the politics of client management and helping me navigate the particular challenges that women faced in our industry. Over wine and pasta, she asked me directly what I thought David's endgame was. I think he wants to destroy my reputation, I told her honestly. During our relationship, he consistently tried to undermine my confidence in my professional abilities. Now that I'm succeeding without him, I think he's trying to prove that he was right all along, that my success was somehow illegitimate. If he can get me fired from a high-profile project, or even just create enough drama that other clients start to question my competence, he damages my career in a way that would be very difficult to recover from. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Men like that don't handle rejection well, she said. They especially don't handle it well when the woman they rejected goes on to achieve success that makes their own accomplishments look smaller by comparison. But David made a crucial mistake by choosing our firm for his little revenge plot. She leaned forward, her expression serious. We've invested too much in your development to let some entitled ex-fiancé destroy what you've built. And we have resources he doesn't know about. She explained that Sterling and Associates had dealt with problematic clients before, men who used their purchasing power to harass female employees or create hostile work environments. The firm had developed specific protocols for documenting and addressing these situations, including relationships with employment attorneys who specialized in workplace harassment cases. If David continued his current behavior, we had options beyond simply enduring his attacks or losing the contract. Friday's review meeting felt like a courtroom proceeding. David arrived with an expanded team that now included his chief financial officer and another lawyer. I presented my work methodically, addressing every concern he'd raised and several he hadn't. My presentation was flawless, backed by research that would have impressed any legitimate client and creative concepts that were both innovative and strategically sound. But David wasn't interested in the quality of my work. He was interested in finding new ways to question it. He criticized font choices, questioned color selections, and suggested that my strategic recommendations showed a fundamental misunderstanding of his company's culture. Every critique was delivered with the same condescending tone I remembered from our relationship, the same implication that my professional judgment was somehow flawed or naive. Margaret let him talk for 20 minutes before intervening. "David," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I've been in this industry for 2 decades, and I've reviewed hundreds of branding presentations. Sarah's work is exceptional by any objective standard. The research is thorough, the creative concepts are innovative, and the strategic recommendations are exactly what I would expect from our most senior consultants. If you have specific concerns about implementation or budget, we can address those. But if you're looking for fundamental changes to an approach that clearly meets professional standards, we need to understand what you're actually trying to achieve." The room went silent. David's lawyers exchanged glances, and I could see them recognizing what Margaret had just done. She'd forced him to either accept the quality of my work or explain why he was rejecting professional-grade deliverables without cause. Either response would be difficult for him to justify if this situation ever required legal review. David's response revealed everything about his true motivations. "This isn't about objective standards," he said, his professional mask finally slipping. "It's about fit. Sarah and I have a history, and I don't think she can separate personal feelings from professional requirements. I'm concerned that her judgment is compromised, and I think this project would benefit from fresh perspective." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Are you saying you knowingly hired a firm where you had a personal relationship with the lead consultant, and you're just now deciding that relationship is problematic?" David realized his mistake immediately. His face flushed, and he looked at his lawyers, who were clearly wishing they were anywhere else. "That's not what I meant," he backtracked. "I just think we need to consider all options for ensuring project success." Robert leaned forward. "David, let me be very clear about something. Sarah Mitchell is one of our most accomplished consultants. Her work on this project has been exemplary. If you're uncomfortable working with her due to personal history, we can certainly assign a different team member to lead the project. But if you're using that personal history to question her professional competence or create a hostile work environment, that's a very different conversation, one that involves legal considerations for both our firms. The meeting ended with an agreement to continue with my leadership of the project, but with additional oversight from Margaret and Robert. David's team left quietly, but I could see the strain in his face. His attempt to undermine me had backfired, exposing his real motivations while strengthening my position within the firm, but I knew this wasn't over. David didn't give up easily, and he definitely didn't handle public humiliation well. Part 3. That weekend, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in months. Not quite victory, because David was still circling like a predator, but a kind of professional validation that felt like armor. Margaret had stood up for me in front of a room full of lawyers and business executives. Robert had made it clear that my work was valued and protected. For the first time since David's name had appeared on that contract, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than just trying to survive his attacks. Monday morning brought a surprise that shifted everything again. Jessica knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between excitement and concern. "Sarah," she said, closing the door behind her, "I just got off a very interesting phone call. Apparently, David Chen has been making inquiries about you with other marketing firms around town. Specifically, he's been asking about your professional reputation, your client relationships, and whether you've ever had any ethical issues in your work." My stomach dropped. This was exactly the kind of behavior I'd feared. The systematic attempt to damage my reputation beyond just our specific project. If David could plant seeds of doubt about my competence with other potential clients or employers, he could destroy my career in Austin's relatively small marketing community. Word traveled fast in our industry, and reputations took years to build but could be destroyed in weeks. "Who told you this?" I asked. Jessica looked uncomfortable. "Someone at Brennan Creative called me off the record. Apparently, David contacted them last week asking about hiring them for a project, but spent most of the conversation asking questions about you. He claimed he was considering poaching you for his in-house team, but wanted to do some due diligence first. They thought it was strange enough to mention it to me at the networking event on Friday." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced during our relationship whenever David had made me question my own reality. But this time, I had context for what was happening. This wasn't random vindictive behavior. This was a calculated campaign to isolate me professionally, exactly the kind of systematic undermining that had characterized our personal relationship. I called Margaret immediately. "We need to talk," I told her. "This situation is escalating beyond what we discussed." She cleared her schedule for lunch, and we met at a quiet restaurant where we could speak privately. When I explained David's inquiries to other firms, her expression grew serious in a way I'd never seen before. "This crosses a line," she said firmly. "Questioning your work on his project is one thing, even if it's unreasonable, but actively trying to damage your reputation with other potential clients or employers? That's tortious interference with business relationships. It's also potentially defamatory if he's making false statements about your competence or ethics." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I'm calling Linda Rodriguez. She's the employment attorney we've worked with before. This needs legal review immediately." The meeting with Linda Rodriguez was scheduled for Wednesday morning. In the meantime, Margaret suggested I reach out to my network discreetly, not to defend myself against David's inquiries, but to understand the scope of what he was doing. I spent Tuesday making casual calls to former clients and colleagues, ostensibly checking in about other projects, but really listening for any signs that David's poison had started spreading. What I discovered was both disturbing and reassuring. 3 other marketing firms had received similar calls from David over the past 2 weeks. Each time, he'd presented himself as a potential client interested in their services, but had spent significant time asking about my work, my reputation, and my relationship with Sterling and Associates. The consistent pattern suggested this wasn't impulsive revenge behavior, but a coordinated effort to systematically damage my standing in the local marketing community. But David had underestimated the relationships I'd built over 6 years of excellent work. Every person I spoke with had found his inquiries strange and inappropriate. Several had refused to discuss me at all, citing professional ethics. Others had given positive references that directly contradicted whatever narrative David was trying to create. His campaign was backfiring, but it was also escalating in a way that required immediate legal intervention. Linda Rodriguez reviewed my documentation with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen similar cases before. The pattern of behavior I'd documented during our relationship, combined with his recent professional harassment, painted a clear picture of what she called malicious interference. In Texas, she explained, I had multiple legal options if David continued his current behavior. I could pursue a restraining order, file a defamation claim, or seek damages for intentional interference with business relationships. But Linda also explained something that made me reconsider my entire approach to this situation. David's behavior wasn't just illegal, it was also incredibly stupid from a business perspective. TechFlow Solutions was months away from their public offering, a process that required extensive due diligence and background checks. If potential investors discovered that the company's CEO was using corporate resources to harass his ex-fiancé, it could destroy their IPO plans and cost millions in lost value. This gave me leverage I hadn't considered before. David needed his company to appear stable and professionally managed to attract investors. A harassment lawsuit from a former employee's ex-fiancé would be exactly the kind of scandal that made investors nervous. Linda suggested we could use this leverage to end his campaign against me without necessarily pursuing lengthy legal proceedings. Thursday morning, I received a text message from David that confirmed everything Linda had predicted. We need to talk, it read. There are some things about this project that require private discussion. The message felt like a trap, but it was also an opportunity. Linda had prepared me for this possibility, coaching me on how to handle any attempt David might make to manipulate or threaten me directly. I responded professionally, suggesting that any concerns about the project should be discussed with Robert present, as we'd agreed in our previous meetings. David's response came quickly. This isn't about the project, Sarah. This is about us. You know what I'm capable of, and you know what I'm willing to do to protect my interests. Meet me tonight at the Daily Grind at 8, or this gets much more difficult for both of us. The message was everything Linda had hoped for. It was clearly threatening, obviously personal rather than professional, and sent from his personal phone rather than company communications. It was also stupid, creating written evidence of harassment that would be difficult for him to explain away if this situation required legal resolution. I screenshot the message and forwarded it to Linda, Margaret, and Robert, then crafted my response carefully. David, I wrote back, I will not be meeting you privately to discuss personal matters related to our professional relationship. If you have concerns about the TechFlow project, please direct them through proper channels as we've previously agreed. Any further personal communications will be documented and forwarded to appropriate parties. Then I blocked his number and waited. The response came through his assistant's email within an hour. Mr. Chen would like to schedule a meeting to discuss potential changes to the project scope and timeline. Could we arrange a conference call for Friday morning to address these concerns? The professional language couldn't hide what was really happening. David was escalating his campaign, but he was also running out of options. He couldn't force me to meet him privately, couldn't continue making inquiries to other firms without creating more evidence of harassment, and couldn't terminate the contract without cause unless he wanted to pay significant financial penalties. Friday's conference call included the full team from both sides, plus Linda Rodriguez participating as Sterling and Associates legal counsel. David's lawyers were also present, creating a formal atmosphere that made casual manipulation impossible. Robert opened the call by stating that any changes to project scope would require clear justification and contract amendments, and that all parties should be prepared to discuss specific concerns about deliverables or timelines. David's presentation was revealing in its desperation. He claimed that market conditions had changed since the project began, requiring a completely different strategic approach. He suggested that the current branding concepts were too conservative for their target market, despite having approved them in previous meetings. Most tellingly, he proposed that the project should be reassigned to Jessica, claiming that her fresh perspective would better serve their evolving needs. Linda's response was precise and devastating. She pointed out that David's concerns weren't based on measurable deficiencies in the work product, but seemed to stem from personal preferences that hadn't been clearly communicated during the project planning phase. She noted that reassigning project leadership without cause would violate the specific terms of the contract, which guaranteed continuity of key personnel, barring performance issues or mutual agreement. Then she delivered the statement that changed everything. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we're also aware that TechFlow Solutions has been making inquiries about Ms. Mitchell's professional reputation with other marketing firms in the Austin area. This behavior could be construed as tortious interference with business relationships, particularly given the personal history between you and Ms. Mitchell. We'd like to understand how these inquiries relate to your current concerns about project management." The silence that followed was profound. David's lawyers were clearly hearing about his inquiries to other firms for the first time, and their expressions suggested they understood the legal implications immediately. David himself looked like someone who'd just realized he'd been playing poker with his cards visible to everyone else at the table. After a moment that felt like an eternity, one of David's lawyers spoke. "We'd like to request a brief recess to confer with our client privately." When the call resumed 15 minutes later, David's tone was completely different. He wanted to make it clear, he said, that TechFlow Solutions was satisfied with the quality of work being provided by Sterling and Associates. Any inquiries he'd made to other firms were purely for informational purposes and didn't reflect any dissatisfaction with the current project. He looked forward to continuing to work with our team, under my leadership, to complete the branding initiative on schedule and within budget. The call ended with agreements about timeline adjustments and final deliverable expectations. But everyone involved understood what had really happened. David had overplayed his hand, creating legal exposure for himself and his company that his lawyers had immediately recognized. His campaign to destroy my reputation had not only failed, it had created evidence that could be used against him if he continued his harassment. After the other participants left the call, Linda, Margaret, Robert, and I debriefed what had just happened. David had essentially admitted to the behavior we'd been documenting, while also committing to end his interference with my professional relationships. His lawyers would almost certainly advise him to complete the contract without further incident, to minimize his legal exposure and protect his company's upcoming IPO. But Linda also warned me that men like David didn't usually accept defeat gracefully. He'd been publicly humiliated by a woman he'd previously controlled, forced to back down in front of his own legal team, and confronted with the reality that his harassment campaign had failed. The immediate legal pressure might stop his overt attacks, but I should remain vigilant for more subtle forms of retaliation. Part 4. The following week passed with an unusual calm that felt more ominous than reassuring. David's team communicated exclusively through his assistant, submitting feedback on schedule and without the nitpicking that had characterized our previous interactions. The requests were reasonable, the approval process straightforward, and the project moved forward exactly as it should have from the beginning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that David was planning something, waiting for the right moment to strike back. My instincts proved correct the following Tuesday. Jessica burst into my office with her laptop open and an expression of barely contained fury. "Sarah," she said, "you need to see this immediately." She turned her screen toward me, showing a post on LinkedIn that made my blood run cold. It was from David's company account, announcing that TechFlow Solutions had decided to bring their marketing operations in-house rather than continuing to work with external consultants. The post was professionally worded and seemingly innocuous, but the implications were devastating. It suggested that their experience with outside marketing firms had been disappointing, that they'd realized their specific needs required internal expertise rather than generic consulting services. Most damaging was a subtle implication that external consultants had failed to understand their company culture and values, necessitating the change in strategy. But David hadn't stopped with his own company's announcement. Jessica showed me 3 additional posts on industry forums and social media platforms, all anonymous but clearly written by the same person. They described experiences with unnamed marketing consultants who had delivered subpar work, failed to meet deadlines, and demonstrated unprofessional behavior during client meetings. The posts didn't mention me by name, but they included enough specific details about recent projects and client interactions that anyone in Austin's marketing community would be able to identify me as the target. This was character assassination disguised as professional feedback, designed to damage my reputation without creating obvious legal liability. David was using the same strategy he'd employed during our relationship, undermining my credibility in ways that were difficult to prove or defend against. The anonymous posts gave him plausible deniability, while still achieving his goal of making potential clients question my competence. I called Linda Rodriguez immediately. She reviewed the posts and confirmed what I'd already suspected. While the content was clearly defamatory, proving that David had written the anonymous posts would be challenging and expensive. The LinkedIn post from his company was more problematic, since it could be interpreted as commentary on their business decision rather than personal attack. Fighting this kind of subtle character assassination required a different strategy than direct legal action. Margaret had a different perspective when we met that afternoon. She'd been following the posts and had noticed something David hadn't anticipated. Several people in the marketing community had started commenting on the anonymous posts, questioning their authenticity and pointing out that they read like personal attacks rather than legitimate professional feedback. The timing of the posts, immediately after the news about TechFlow bringing marketing in-house, was suspicious enough that industry veterans were beginning to connect the dots. More importantly, Margaret had been reaching out to her own network, former colleagues and clients who knew my work personally. She'd been sharing the story of David's harassment campaign, not as gossip, but as a professional warning about a client who used corporate resources to attack individual consultants. The response had been overwhelmingly supportive, with several prominent marketing executives offering to provide character references if needed. Thursday brought vindication in a form I hadn't expected. Sarah Blackwood, the marketing director at one of Austin's largest tech companies, called to offer me a consulting contract for a project that would be more lucrative than the TechFlow account. She'd heard about David's behavior through industry connections and wanted to demonstrate that professional retaliation wouldn't be tolerated in Austin's business community. The call was flattering and professionally validating, but it also revealed something important about David's strategy. His campaign wasn't just failing, it was actively backfiring. By targeting me so obviously and vindictively, he'd created sympathy for my situation and suspicion about his motives. Business leaders who might never have heard of me before were now aware of my work and impressed by how I'd handled an impossible situation. Over the following weeks, similar opportunities emerged. 3 different companies reached out about potential projects, all of them making it clear that they'd heard about David's harassment and wanted to support a consultant who'd been unfairly targeted. My calendar filled with meetings and proposals that would have taken months to generate through normal business development efforts. David's attempt to destroy my reputation had inadvertently created the best marketing campaign of my career. But the most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source. Mark Stevens, a business journalist for the Austin Business Journal, called to ask about rumors he'd been hearing regarding TechFlow Solutions' treatment of vendors and consultants. He'd noticed the pattern of anonymous posts attacking local marketing professionals, and had started investigating whether there was a coordinated campaign behind them. Mark had discovered that all the anonymous posts traced back to IP addresses registered to TechFlow Solutions, meaning David had been using company resources to conduct his harassment campaign. This created potential legal problems for both David, personally, and his company, particularly with their IPO preparation requiring clean regulatory compliance. Mark wanted to give me an opportunity to comment on the situation before he published his investigation. I declined to comment for the article, following Linda's advice about avoiding public statements that could escalate the legal situation. But Mark's investigation proceeded without my input, and the article he published was devastating for David's reputation. It detailed a pattern of corporate harassment, including the anonymous posts, the inquiries to other marketing firms, and the suspicious timing of TechFlow's decision to terminate their consulting relationship. The article didn't mention my name, referring to me only as a local marketing consultant who had previously been engaged to the company's CEO. But it painted a clear picture of a business leader who used company resources for personal vendettas, creating exactly the kind of scandal that made investors nervous about corporate governance and leadership stability. The response was swift and brutal. TechFlow's lead investor called an emergency board meeting to discuss the implications of the article for their planned IPO. 2 major clients canceled contracts, citing concerns about the company's management practices. Industry publications picked up the story, turning David's harassment campaign into a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing personal grievances with business operations. Within a week, David was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. His lawyers reached out to Linda Rodriguez requesting a meeting to discuss resolution of all outstanding issues between David and me. The man who'd tried to destroy my career was now facing the potential loss of his own company and professional reputation. The meeting took place in Linda's office on a gray Thursday morning in November. David looked like a shadow of the confident man who'd walked into our conference room just 2 months earlier. His expensive suit couldn't hide the exhaustion in his face or the defeat in his posture. His lawyers did most of the talking, presenting a settlement offer that included a formal apology, financial compensation for the damage to my reputation, and legally binding agreements that would prevent any future harassment or retaliation. But Linda had prepared a different kind of resolution, one that addressed not just the immediate situation, but the broader pattern of behavior that had led to it. The settlement she proposed included David's agreement to participate in professional counseling focused on workplace harassment and relationship dynamics. He would also be required to make a public statement acknowledging his inappropriate behavior and apologizing not just to me, but to the broader professional community he'd tried to manipulate. David's initial response was predictable. He couldn't accept terms that would require public admission of wrongdoing, couldn't agree to counseling requirements that implied he had behavioral problems, couldn't commit to apologies that would further damage his professional reputation. But his lawyers understood something he was still refusing to acknowledge. He no longer had the leverage to negotiate from a position of strength. His harassment campaign had failed, his business was in jeopardy, and his options were rapidly disappearing. The negotiation continued for 3 hours, with David's position weakening as his lawyers reviewed the evidence Linda had compiled. The documentation of his behavior during our relationship, the professional harassment after our breakup, the anonymous posts attacking my reputation, and the business interference that had violated multiple laws. By lunch, his lawyers were advising him to accept Linda's terms, warning that refusal could result in criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would destroy both his personal wealth and his company's future. Part 5. The final agreement was signed on a Friday afternoon that felt like the end of a very long nightmare. David's public statement was posted on his company's website and social media accounts, acknowledging that he had used inappropriate methods to address personal grievances with a former business partner. He apologized for any damage to my professional reputation and committed to ensuring that TechFlow Solutions would maintain the highest standards of business ethics going forward. The statement was carefully worded to minimize legal liability, while still providing the public acknowledgement Linda had demanded. But its impact went beyond the specific words. Industry publications picked up the story. Business leaders throughout Austin read the apology, and my professional network understood that David had been forced to publicly admit his harassment campaign. More importantly, the settlement included financial compensation that reflected not just the immediate damage to my reputation, but the emotional distress and professional disruption David's behavior had caused. The amount was significant enough to make him understand the cost of his actions, while also providing me with resources to expand my own consulting practice and pursue opportunities that his harassment had temporarily derailed. The counseling requirement was perhaps the most important element of the settlement. David would be required to complete a professional development program focused on leadership ethics and workplace relationships. He would also participate in therapy specifically addressing the behavioral patterns that had led to his harassment campaign. Progress reports would be provided to Linda quarterly, ensuring that he was actually engaging with the process rather than simply going through the motions. 3 months later, I sat in my new office overlooking Town Lake, reviewing proposals for projects that would have been impossible to imagine when David first walked into Sterling & Associates. My consulting practice had grown beyond anything I'd envisioned, with clients who sought me out specifically because of my reputation for handling difficult situations with professionalism and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me. David's attempt to destroy my career had actually accelerated my professional growth in ways that normal business development never could have achieved. His harassment had forced me to develop legal knowledge, professional networks, and strategic thinking skills that made me a more valuable consultant. His public humiliation had created industry awareness of my work that would have taken years to build through conventional marketing. But the most significant change wasn't professional, it was personal. The woman who'd doubted herself during our relationship, who'd questioned her own perceptions and expertise, had been replaced by someone who understood her worth and refused to accept treatment that diminished it. David's harassment campaign had inadvertently forced me to develop the confidence and self-advocacy skills that therapy alone might never have provided. Jessica stopped by my office one afternoon with news that confirmed everything we'd suspected about David's motivations. TechFlow's IPO had been postponed indefinitely, she reported, due to concerns about corporate governance and leadership stability. David had been forced to step back from day-to-day operations, with his board bringing in an interim CEO to manage the company's transition. The harassment scandal had cost him not just his reputation, but his control over the company he'd built. The story spread through Austin's business community as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing personal grievances with professional relationships. David's name became synonymous with poor judgment and unethical behavior, while my reputation was enhanced by how I'd handled an impossible situation with dignity and strategic thinking. 6 months after our final settlement meeting, I received an invitation that felt like the ultimate vindication. The Austin Business Women's Association wanted me to speak at their annual conference about overcoming professional harassment and building resilient careers. The topic was, when personal becomes professional, protecting yourself in the modern workplace. Standing at the podium that evening, looking out at an audience of accomplished women who'd faced their own versions of workplace harassment and professional undermining, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. David's attempt to destroy my career had actually revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, forced me to develop skills I hadn't realized I needed, and connected me with supporters I might never have met under normal circumstances. The speech I gave that night became the foundation for a workshop series I developed about professional resilience and workplace harassment. The workshops attracted participants from across Texas, creating a secondary revenue stream for my consulting practice, while also helping other women develop the tools they needed to protect themselves from the kind of systematic undermining I'd experienced. A year after the settlement, Margaret called with news that felt like cosmic justice. TechFlow Solutions had been acquired by a larger competitor for significantly less than their projected IPO valuation. David's harassment campaign and its aftermath had cost his company millions in lost value and damaged reputation. He'd retained a small percentage of equity in the acquisition, but his role in the new organization was purely advisory, with no operational authority or public representation. The acquisition announcement mentioned that the previous CEO had stepped down to pursue other interests, but industry insiders understood the real story. David had been forced out of his own company, his professional reputation permanently damaged by a harassment campaign that had backfired spectacularly. The man who'd tried to control my career had lost control of his own. That evening, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction that felt entirely earned. Not because David had suffered consequences for his behavior, though that was justice, but because I'd refused to let him define my worth or limit my potential. The scared woman who'd sat in his office 9 months earlier, listening to him question her competence and professionalism, had been replaced by someone who understood that her value wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion. The final chapter of our story came in the form of a brief email I received on a Tuesday morning in spring. It was from David's personal account, not filtered through lawyers or company communications. The message was simple. I was wrong about everything. I'm sorry. No explanation, no justification, no attempt to minimize what he'd done. Just acknowledgement and apology. I read the message twice, then saved it to the folder where I kept documentation of our entire relationship and its aftermath. Then I deleted it from my inbox and moved on with my day. David's apology was meaningful, but it wasn't necessary. I'd already found the closure I needed through my own growth and success. The silence stretched for exactly 37 seconds after David's lawyer finished speaking. I know because I counted, watching the second hand move on the conference room clock while everyone processed what had just been proposed. David wanted to settle, they said. He was prepared to acknowledge that there had been some miscommunication about project expectations. He was willing to complete the contract as originally agreed, with no further changes to scope or leadership. In exchange, all parties would sign confidentiality agreements preventing any discussion of the project details or professional interactions. Linda Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That's an interesting offer," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that made opposing counsel nervous. "But I think there might be some confusion about our position here. Ms. Mitchell isn't looking to settle a dispute. She's looking to complete a project that she's been hired to do, while being protected from further harassment. Your client's behavior has created legal liability, not a business disagreement that requires compromise." David's primary lawyer, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and expensive glasses, shifted uncomfortably. "We understand there have been some communication challenges," she said carefully. "Our client recognizes that his management style may have been more direct than Ms. Mitchell is accustomed to. He's prepared to adjust his approach to ensure a more collaborative working relationship moving forward." The audacity was breathtaking. David was trying to reframe months of systematic harassment as a management style difference, as if questioning my competence, spreading rumors about my work, and threatening my career were simply examples of being too direct. But Linda had anticipated this strategy, and her response was surgical in its precision. "Communication challenges," she repeated slowly. "Let me make sure I understand your client's communication style. Does it typically include making inquiries about employees' professional reputations with competitors? Does it involve questioning documented research without providing alternative sources? Does it include personal text messages threatening consequences for not agreeing to private meetings?" She opened a folder and began reading directly from the documentation we'd compiled. "On October 15th, your client contacted Brennan Creative, Morrison & Associates, and Blue Sky Marketing to inquire about Ms. Mitchell's work history and professional reputation. On October 22nd, he sent a personal text message stating that Ms. Mitchell knew what he was capable of and implying consequences if she didn't meet him privately. On October 25th, he posted anonymous reviews on 3 industry forums describing experiences with unnamed consultants that clearly referenced Ms. Mitchell's recent projects. The room had gone completely quiet. David's team of lawyers looked like they were hearing some of these details for the first time, their expressions growing more concerned with each item Linda recited. David himself had gone pale, apparently not realizing how thoroughly his behavior had been documented and how clearly it established a pattern of harassment rather than professional disagreement. Linda continued reading for another 5 minutes, detailing every inappropriate contact, every professional boundary crossed, every attempt to damage my reputation or interfere with my work. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked directly at David's legal team. "This isn't a communication style," she said. "This is systematic harassment with clear legal implications. And given that your client's company is preparing for a public offering, I imagine your board of directors would be very interested to learn how corporate resources are being used." The mention of the IPO hit exactly as Linda had intended. David's CFO, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up, sharply. The lawyers exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their client's exposure. Public companies faced intense scrutiny of their corporate governance and executive behavior. A harassment scandal involving the CEO could derail their offering entirely, costing millions in lost valuation and delayed market entry. David finally spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Sarah is blowing this completely out of proportion. We dated. It didn't work out. Now we're trying to work together, professionally. Everything else is just her inability to separate personal feelings from business relationships. She's always been overly emotional about these things." The comment was perfect in its stupidity. Linda's smile widened slightly as she made a note. "So, you're acknowledging that you had a personal relationship with Ms. Mitchell, and you deliberately hired her firm knowing that history? And your position is that she's the one who can't maintain professional boundaries?" Robert Kim leaned forward. "David, let me ask you directly. When you contacted Sterling and Associates about this project, did you request specifically to work with Sarah? Or were you assigned to her as the lead consultant for your account?" David's hesitation lasted just long enough to make his answer obvious to everyone in the room. "We requested the best consultant for a project of this scope," he said finally. "Sarah's reputation preceded her. That's not the same as specifically requesting her personally." But Jessica had been prepared for this moment. She pulled out her laptop and opened a file that made David's face go white. "Actually," she said, "our initial project notes show that TechFlow specifically requested Sarah Mitchell by name during the first planning call. The exact quote from your assistant was that Mr. Chen had heard excellent things about Sarah's work and wanted her to lead the project personally." She turned the laptop screen so everyone could see the time-stamped notes from the initial client intake. The silence that followed was devastating. David had been caught in a direct lie, in front of his own legal team, on the record in a meeting that was being professionally transcribed. Linda made another note, and I could see David's lawyers beginning to understand just how badly their client had positioned himself. Margaret Torres, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. "David," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been navigating complex business relationships for decades, "I think it's time for some honesty here. You hired our firm specifically to work with Sarah because of your personal history. You've spent 2 months trying to undermine her work, question her competence, and damage her professional reputation. The question now is whether you want to resolve this quietly or whether you want it to become a public legal matter that follows both you and your company for years." She leaned forward slightly. "Because let me be very clear about something. Sarah Mitchell is one of the most talented consultants I've worked with in 20 years. Her work on your project has been exemplary. If you continue this harassment campaign, you won't just be fighting her. You'll be fighting our entire firm, our legal resources, and our professional network. And given what's at stake for your IPO, I don't think that's a fight you want to have." David's primary lawyer requested a brief recess. His team huddled in the hallway for 20 minutes while we waited in the conference room. When they returned, their entire approach had changed. Gone was the aggressive posturing and attempts to minimize David's behavior. Instead, they were ready to negotiate seriously about resolution that would protect all parties' interests. The terms they proposed were comprehensive and heavily weighted in my favor. David would issue a formal written apology acknowledging his inappropriate behavior and confirming my professional competence and the quality of my work. He would cease all attempts to interfere with my business relationships, including no further contact with other marketing firms about me. He would complete the current contract without further changes to scope or leadership, providing appropriate compensation for the additional work his harassment had created. Most importantly, David would agree to a restraining order that prevented any personal contact with me outside of necessary business communications. All future interactions would be conducted through formal channels with witnesses present. Any violation of these terms would trigger immediate legal action and public disclosure of the settlement terms. But Linda had one additional requirement that surprised everyone, including me. She wanted David to participate in professional development, training focused on workplace harassment and appropriate business relationships. The training would be conducted by a reputable firm that specialized in corporate ethics, with completion certificates provided to our legal team. It was a requirement that acknowledged the systematic nature of his behavior while providing him with tools to prevent similar situations in the future. David's initial response was predictable resistance. He couldn't agree to harassment training because that implied he'd committed harassment, which he continued to deny. He couldn't accept a formal apology because that would damage his reputation and potentially affect his company's valuation. He couldn't agree to restrictions on his business communications because that would interfere with his ability to manage his company effectively. But his lawyers understood something David was still refusing to acknowledge. He no longer had the power to set terms or conditions. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the legal exposure was significant, and the potential damage to his business was enormous. They spent another hour walking him through the realities of his situation, making it clear that his options were limited and getting worse with every day he delayed resolution. The final settlement negotiations took place over 3 separate meetings spanning 2 weeks. Each session revealed new aspects of David's harassment campaign that even I hadn't been aware of. He'd contacted not just marketing firms, but also potential clients who might have hired me independently. He'd reached out to professional organizations where I held memberships, asking questions about my standing and reputation. He'd even attempted to contact former clients directly, ostensibly for reference checks, but actually fishing for any criticism or complaints about my work. The scope of his campaign was staggering in its breadth and vindictive in its intent. But it was also incredibly stupid from a legal perspective, creating a documented trail of harassment that would be almost impossible to defend in court. Every contact, every inquiry, every attempt to damage my reputation added to the evidence of systematic interference with my business relationships. Linda used each new revelation to strengthen our negotiating position. The settlement terms grew more comprehensive with each meeting, including financial compensation for lost business opportunities, reimbursement for legal fees, and increasingly strict restrictions on David's future behavior. By the final session, David's lawyers were advising him to accept our terms without further negotiation, warning that continued resistance would only make his situation worse. The signed settlement agreement was 12 pages long and covered every aspect of David's behavior and its consequences. He admitted to no legal wrongdoing, but agreed to restrictions and compensation that made his liability clear to anyone who read the document. More importantly, the agreement included provisions that would make any future harassment immediately actionable, with predetermined financial penalties and legal consequences. But the most satisfying element of the settlement wasn't the money. or the legal protections. It was the transformation I'd undergone during the process. The woman who'd initially been intimidated by David's manipulation had been replaced by someone who understood her worth and refused to accept treatment that diminished it. I'd learned to document harassment, navigate legal systems, and advocate for myself in ways that would serve me for the rest of my career. 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, TechFlow Solutions announced that they were postponing their IPO indefinitely due to market conditions and internal restructuring needs. Industry publications speculated about the reasons for the delay, with some pointing to recent management changes and corporate governance concerns. David's harassment campaign hadn't just failed to destroy my career, it had seriously damaged his own company's prospects and his personal reputation within the Austin business community. The project that had started this entire nightmare was completed on schedule and exceeded every professional standard. The rebranding strategy I'd developed for TechFlow was innovative, comprehensive, and strategically sound. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a portfolio piece I'd have been proud to showcase. Instead, it became evidence of my ability to deliver exceptional work under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But the real victory wasn't professional, it was personal. David's attempt to control and diminish me had backfired completely, forcing me to develop strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and connecting me with advocates I might never have met under normal circumstances. His harassment had inadvertently created the most effective marketing campaign of my career, with business leaders throughout Austin aware of my work and impressed by how I'd handled an impossible situation. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at a professional development conference about handling workplace harassment and building resilient careers. The audience was full of women who'd faced their own versions of the systematic undermining I'd experienced, and their response to my story was both heartening and sobering. David's behavior wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that many professional women faced from men who couldn't accept their success or independence. The speech led to additional speaking opportunities, consulting work with companies wanting to improve their harassment policies, and connections with other women who'd fought similar battles. What had started as David's attempt to isolate and diminish me had actually expanded my professional network and enhanced my reputation in ways that normal business development could never have achieved. A year after the settlement, I received word that David had left TechFlow Solutions entirely, selling his remaining stake in the company and moving to another state. His departure was described as pursuing new opportunities, but industry insiders understood that his reputation in Austin had been permanently damaged by the harassment scandal. The man who'd tried to control my career had lost control of his own. The final chapter of our professional relationship came in the form of a reference check I received 2 years later. A potential employer had contacted me about David's application for a senior executive position, asking about his management style and professional behavior. It was the kind of call that could have been an opportunity for petty revenge, a chance to torpedo his career the way he'd tried to torpedo mine. Instead, I provided a measured, factual response that focused on observable behaviors and documented patterns. I mentioned his tendency to personalize business relationships, his difficulty accepting feedback from team members, and his history of using company resources for personal conflicts. I didn't need to embellish or exaggerate. The facts spoke for themselves. The company didn't hire David. Whether my reference was the deciding factor, I never knew, but I felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that his behavior had natural consequences that didn't require my active participation to enforce. Men like David typically created their own professional downfall through patterns of behavior that eventually became impossible to ignore or excuse. 3 years after our settlement, my consulting practice had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when David first walked into Sterling & Associates. I had a team of talented consultants, offices in 2 cities, and clients who sought me out specifically because of my reputation for handling complex situations with integrity and strategic thinking. The woman who'd been intimidated by David's manipulation had built something he could never touch or diminish. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's worst impulses had contributed to my greatest professional success. His attempt to destroy my reputation had actually enhanced it. His harassment had forced me to develop legal knowledge and advocacy skills that made me a more valuable consultant. His vindictive campaign had connected me with supporters and opportunities that normal networking might never have provided. But the most important transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion, that my success wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval, and that my future wasn't limited by anyone else's attempts to control or diminish me. David's harassment had been intended to make me smaller, but it had actually forced me to become larger, stronger, and more resilient than I'd ever been before. Standing in my corner office 5 years later, looking out at the Austin skyline and reviewing proposals for projects that would have been impossible to imagine when this story began, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. David's name rarely crossed my mind anymore, except as a cautionary tale I shared with other women about the importance of documentation, legal protection, and refusing to accept treatment that diminished their worth. The scared woman who'd sat in that first settlement meeting, uncertain of her value and afraid of professional consequences, had been replaced by someone who understood that her greatest power came not from avoiding conflict, but from handling it with intelligence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to her own dignity. David had taught me that lesson, though certainly not in the way he'd intended. The morning everything truly changed began with a phone call I wasn't expecting. It was 7 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, 3 years after the settlement with David, and I was reviewing quarterly reports for my consulting firm when my assistant buzzed through with unusual urgency. "Sarah," she said, "there's someone on the line who says it's about TechFlow Solutions. Says it's urgent and relates to your previous contract with them." My blood went cold. The settlement agreement had been ironclad, with severe financial penalties for any violation of its terms. David had been required to maintain complete professional distance, with all future contact strictly prohibited unless it involved legal emergencies or court-mandated communications. I'd assumed that chapter of my life was permanently closed, filed away with other difficult lessons learned and obstacles overcome. The voice on the phone wasn't David's. It belonged to Amanda Rivera, who introduced herself as the new CEO of TechFlow Solutions. Her tone was professional, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "I need to speak with you about some discoveries we've made regarding your previous work with our company. There are some irregularities that require immediate attention, and frankly, we need your help to understand what happened during that period." I felt my carefully constructed professional calm beginning to crack. Irregularities could mean anything from accounting discrepancies to legal violations, and given David's history of using company resources for personal vendettas, the possibilities were troubling. I told Amanda I'd need to review the settlement terms before discussing any TechFlow-related matters, and we scheduled a meeting for later that week with my attorney present. Linda Rodriguez was as surprised as I was by the contact. She reviewed the settlement agreement thoroughly before our meeting, confirming that the new CEO's outreach didn't technically violate any terms since David was no longer involved with the company. But she advised caution, warning that former clients sometimes tried to revisit completed projects when they faced financial or legal difficulties, looking for consultants to blame for broader business problems. The meeting took place at Linda's office rather than mine, a neutral location that reinforced the formal nature of our discussion. Amanda Rivera was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd been brought in specifically to clean up someone else's mess. She arrived with TechFlow's current legal counsel and their head of internal audit, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a deposition than a business consultation. Amanda's opening statement was direct and unsettling. "Ms. Mitchell," she began, "we've been conducting a comprehensive review of TechFlow's operations during the transition period after David Chen's departure. What we've discovered raises serious questions about how company resources were used and whether proper procedures were followed during several client relationships, including yours. She opened a laptop and began walking through financial records that showed patterns of spending I hadn't been aware of during my work with the company. David had apparently used corporate accounts to pay for private investigators who'd researched my background, my professional history, and my personal relationships. He'd hired reputation management services to monitor my online presence and track mentions of my work in industry publications. Most disturbing, he'd paid for legal consultations about ways to interfere with my business relationships without creating obvious liability. The scope of David's surveillance was staggering and deeply violating. While I'd been focused on completing the branding project and defending myself against his overt harassment, he'd been conducting a shadow campaign that invaded every aspect of my professional and personal life. The private investigators had compiled detailed reports about my daily routines, my client meetings, even my social activities and friendships. They'd photographed me leaving my apartment, followed me to business lunches, and documented my interactions with colleagues and potential clients. Linda's expression grew increasingly grim as Amanda continued her presentation. This wasn't just harassment, she explained. It was stalking conducted with corporate resources and professional cover. David had used his position as CEO to authorize surveillance activities that would have been clearly illegal if conducted by a private individual. The paper trail showed systematic invasion of privacy that went far beyond anything we'd documented during the original settlement negotiations. But Amanda's next revelation was even more disturbing. The internal audit had discovered that David had been using TechFlow's legal department to research ways to damage my reputation and interfere with my business relationships. Company attorneys had been instructed to investigate defamation laws, business interference statutes, and methods for conducting anonymous attacks on professional reputations. They'd even drafted template complaints that could be filed against me with professional licensing boards and industry organizations. The attorneys had apparently questioned these instructions, noting that the research seemed unrelated to legitimate business purposes. But David had overruled their concerns, claiming that understanding competitive intelligence and reputation management was essential for protecting TechFlow's interests. He'd forced the legal department to participate in his harassment campaign by framing it as corporate security research. Amanda's team had also discovered evidence that David had attempted to manipulate the original settlement negotiations by withholding information from his own attorneys. He'd instructed company staff not to mention certain activities to legal counsel, claiming they were confidential business strategies that didn't require disclosure. His lawyers had negotiated the settlement without full knowledge of their clients' behavior, which potentially invalidated some of the protections he'd received. The implications were staggering. David hadn't just violated the spirit of our settlement agreement, he'd potentially committed criminal violations that could result in serious legal consequences. The surveillance activities constituted stalking under Texas law, the corporate resource misuse could trigger federal fraud charges, and the interference with my business relationships had caused quantifiable financial damages that far exceeded our original settlement terms. Linda immediately recognized the opportunity this presented. The new evidence didn't just strengthen my position against David personally, it created potential claims against TechFlow Solutions for enabling and facilitating his harassment campaign. The company had provided the resources, legal cover, and corporate structure that made David's surveillance possible. Even though they were now cooperating with the investigation, they could still face significant liability for their role in the harassment. But Amanda had approached us for a different reason than I'd initially assumed. TechFlow wasn't trying to blame me for their business problems or revisit our original agreement. Instead, they were facing potential criminal investigation and civil liability based on David's actions, and they needed my cooperation to demonstrate that they were addressing the situation appropriately. The company's board had terminated David with cause, revoked all his benefits and severance packages, and was considering whether to pursue legal action against him personally. More importantly, they wanted to make things right with me. Amanda's proposal was comprehensive and unprecedented in my experience. TechFlow would provide additional financial compensation that reflected the true scope of David's harassment, including the surveillance activities I hadn't known about. They would fund a complete security review of my personal and professional systems to ensure that David's surveillance hadn't compromised my privacy or business operations. They would also provide written recommendations and references that explicitly countered any damage David's campaign might have caused to my professional reputation. But the most significant element of their proposal was an offer to retain my consulting services for a comprehensive review of TechFlow's corporate governance and ethical policies. They wanted me to help them develop systems that would prevent future harassment and ensure that company resources could never again be used for personal vendettas. The irony was perfect. David's attempt to destroy my career had ultimately led to the most lucrative and meaningful contract of my professional life. The financial terms Amanda proposed were substantial enough that Linda requested time to review them with forensic accountants and tax specialists. The compensation package included damages for the surveillance activities, reimbursement for security measures I'd need to implement, and consulting fees for the governance work that would extend over 12 months. The total value exceeded anything I'd earned from a single client relationship, transforming David's harassment into the foundation for unprecedented business growth. But beyond the financial benefits, Amanda's offer represented something more important: complete vindication of my professional reputation and public acknowledgement that I'd been the victim of systematic corporate harassment. TechFlow's board would issue a formal statement acknowledging David's inappropriate use of company resources and explicitly clearing my name of any wrongdoing. The statement would be distributed to industry publications, professional organizations, and the broader Austin business community. The governance consulting work began immediately, giving me unprecedented access to TechFlow's internal operations and decision-making processes. What I discovered was a company culture that had enabled David's behavior through lack of oversight, inadequate policies, and failure to establish clear boundaries between personal and professional conduct. The harassment campaign against me had been possible because no one had been monitoring how corporate resources were being used or questioning unusual expenditures and legal requests. My recommendations included comprehensive policy reforms, mandatory training programs, and oversight mechanisms that would prevent future abuse of corporate resources. But more importantly, I helped TechFlow develop a culture of accountability that encouraged employees to question inappropriate directives and report concerning behavior. The company that had facilitated my harassment became a model for preventing similar situations in other organizations. The criminal investigation into David's activities proceeded simultaneously with my consulting work. Federal prosecutors were interested in the corporate resource misuse, while local authorities focused on the stalking and surveillance charges. David's legal situation deteriorated rapidly as investigators uncovered the full scope of his activities and the systematic nature of his harassment campaign. 6 months into the investigation, David's attorneys approached Linda about a comprehensive plea agreement that would resolve all criminal and civil matters simultaneously. David was facing potential federal fraud charges, state stalking charges, and civil liability that could bankrupt him personally. His company's stock had been frozen pending the investigation. His professional reputation was destroyed, and his legal fees were mounting faster than he could pay them. The plea negotiations revealed details about David's mindset and motivations that were both illuminating and disturbing. According to his attorneys, David had convinced himself that my professional success was somehow illegitimate, that I'd advanced my career through manipulation and connections rather than competence. He'd developed an elaborate conspiracy theory in which I was part of a network of women who were unfairly disadvantaged men in the business world. His harassment campaign had been intended not just to damage my specific career, but to expose what he saw as systematic bias in favor of women in professional settings. He'd planned to use evidence from his surveillance to support broader claims about gender discrimination against men, positioning himself as a victim of reverse sexism rather than a perpetrator of harassment. The delusion was complete and terrifying in its scope. David's final settlement included guilty pleas to federal fraud and state stalking charges, with prison time that would effectively end his business career. He agreed to comprehensive restitution that included not just financial damages, but also funding for security measures, counseling services, and legal protections that would prevent any future contact or harassment. Most importantly, he agreed to a detailed public statement acknowledging his behavior and accepting full responsibility for the harassment campaign. The statement was released simultaneously with news of his guilty pleas, creating a public record that definitively established the facts of his harassment campaign and my complete innocence in the matter. Industry publications covered the story extensively, with several noting that David's case had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing personal grievances with corporate resources. But the most satisfying element of David's downfall wasn't the criminal conviction or financial restitution. It was the complete collapse of the narrative he'd tried to create about my professional competence and ethical standards. The investigation had revealed that every attack he'd made on my reputation was projection of his own failings. While questioning my research methods, he'd been falsifying expense reports. While claiming I was unprofessional, he'd been using company resources for personal vendettas. While suggesting I was manipulative, he'd been conducting systematic surveillance and character assassination. The contrast between David's criminal behavior and my professional conduct became a powerful vindication that resonated throughout the Austin business community. Client inquiries increased dramatically as business leaders sought to work with someone who'd maintained integrity under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. My consulting practice expanded to include corporate ethics training, harassment, prevention programs, and crisis management services that directly drew on my experience with David's campaign. 3 years after David's conviction, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about corporate harassment and the need for stronger oversight of how companies use resources in personnel disputes. My testimony helped inform legislation that created new reporting requirements and penalty structures for organizations that facilitate workplace harassment. The harassment I'd endured had contributed to legal reforms that would protect other women from similar attacks. The personal transformation was even more profound than the professional vindication. The woman who'd been intimidated by David's manipulation had become someone who understood that her greatest strength came from refusing to be diminished by others' attacks. I'd learned that documentation, legal knowledge, and strategic thinking were more powerful tools than emotional responses or attempts to avoid conflict. 5 years after our first encounter in that Sterling & Associates conference room, I stood before an audience of business leaders at the Austin Convention Center, delivering the keynote address for a conference on corporate ethics and professional resilience. The speech focused on lessons learned from surviving systematic harassment and building careers that couldn't be destroyed by vindictive individuals or toxic work environments. In the audience, I spotted several faces that had been part of this journey. Margaret Torres, now retired but still mentoring young professionals. Jessica Rivera, who'd started her own consulting firm with techniques she'd learned from watching my situation unfold. Linda Rodriguez, whose reputation as a harassment attorney had grown substantially based on our successful case. Even Amanda Rivera was there, representing TechFlow's ongoing commitment to ethical business practices. David's name wasn't mentioned in my speech, but his impact was present in every recommendation I made about protecting professional reputations, documenting inappropriate behavior, and building support networks that could withstand systematic attacks. His harassment campaign had inadvertently created a playbook for surviving and thriving despite workplace abuse, resources that were now helping other women navigate similar challenges. The final slide of my presentation showed the growth trajectory of my consulting firm over the past 5 years. What had started as a response to David's harassment had become a comprehensive business focused on helping organizations and individuals build resilient, ethical professional cultures. The woman he'd tried to destroy had become more successful than either of us had imagined possible when this story began. After the presentation, a young marketing professional approached me with a story that sounded painfully familiar. Her former supervisor was using his current position to undermine her reputation and interfere with her job search, creating obstacles that felt insurmountable. But she'd heard my speech and wanted to know if the strategies I'd described could help her situation. I gave her Linda Rodriguez's contact information and my own card, promising that she didn't have to face harassment alone. The support network that had helped me survive David's attacks was now available to help other women navigate similar challenges. What had started as my personal nightmare had become a resource for preventing other people from experiencing the same kind of systematic abuse. Walking back to my car that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. David's harassment had been intended to make me smaller, to convince me that my success was illegitimate and my future was limited. Instead, it had forced me to become larger, stronger, and more resilient than I'd ever imagined possible. His worst impulses had contributed to my greatest achievements. His vindictive attacks had enhanced my reputation, and his criminal behavior had ultimately destroyed only himself. The scared woman who'd sat in that first settlement meeting, uncertain of her worth and afraid of professional consequences, had been replaced by someone who understood that her value couldn't be diminished by anyone else's opinion. David had taught me that lesson, though certainly not in the way he'd intended. And now, 5 years later, I was using that knowledge to help other women understand their own worth and build careers that no one could destroy. The Austin skyline stretched out before me as I drove home, the same view I'd had from my office window when David first walked into my professional life. But everything else had changed. The woman behind the wheel was confident, successful, and surrounded by supporters who valued her contributions. The man who'd tried to control her destiny was serving time in federal prison, his reputation destroyed, and his career finished. Justice had been served. But more importantly, I'd learned that my greatest power came not from avoiding conflict, but from handling it with intelligence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to my own dignity. David's harassment had been meant to teach me my place, but instead it had taught me my worth. And that knowledge, hard-earned and battle-tested, would guide me through whatever challenges lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.